This is the Fire These Times, and I'm your host, Ayoub. In this third season, we will be exploring internationalist solidarity, prefigurative politics, solarpunk, and how to tackle some of the most pressing challenges of our times. Each episode will be on one or more of these topics. But before getting into today's topic, I wanted to quickly tell you that you can support this podcast for as little as $2 or $5 a month on patreon.com/firethesetimes. That is patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing it with your friends and families and leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps it get more exposure and introduce it to more folks. That's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Okay, so if it's okay with you, can you start with just like introducing yourself, name, pronouns, what you do, where you come from, that sort of thing, whatever you want to share?
Yeah, for sure. My name's Andre. I go by HydroponicTrash online, both on Twitter and TikTok. I'm a hacker, gardener. I do a lot of just random stuff here and there. I write speculative solarpunk fiction, and I do a lot of DIY articles on Substack where I release like long form articles either about solarpunk or just about building things in general. So
I feel like folks who have been listening to this podcast for some time probably know already what solarpunk is, but I do like to have different folks try and define it because I always get a different answer, although they're all kind of obviously linked, but the way people frame it can be quite interesting in different ways. So how would you define it?
I just find solarpunk to be both like a speculative fiction genre. I mean, that's kind of what it kind of started out as.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, I kind of see it as kind of a new way of conceptualizing science fiction and kind of like a framework to work off of thinking about different types of futures. I think we get caught up a lot of times in dystopic futures are kind of the norm for most people. But having any kind of hope for the future, I think is really interesting. So I think solarpunk differentiates itself a lot from other both like fiction genres and just like other forms of imagining futures, just in the way that like it combines social change with technology and the ecology, because a lot of different frameworks, a way about thinking about the future is we should return back to the past of like some time that existed in the past. But I really like solarpunk because it's looking more towards the future, really trying to imagine the changes that we can make that aren't reliant on getting rid of technology, but also is questioning like where does our technology come from, how do we use technology in appropriate ways, what are some ways that like we can go into a better future without also extracting the planet but also exploiting other people. And so I think that's like directly tied into kind of like the solar punk ethos, or like the punk aspect of it a lot as well. That's kind of intertwined with kind of the social change that's behind all of it.
Yeah, thanks. And so I asked you to come on because I read this super long essay that you've written on your Substack, which I will obviously link in the show notes as I often do. And the Substack, by the way, is called anarchosolarpunk.substack.com, right? Yeah, that one. So people should definitely check that out. So so the title of that piece, essay, article, whatever, is Solarpunk, Acid Communism, Capitalist Co-opting, and Learning from the Counterculture. It's super long, as I said, so probably it would take too long to explain all of it, so we won't do that. But can you kind of walk us through some of the general points and kind of what motivated you to write that one?
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely kind of a combination of different ideas and topics that I've been kind of thinking over for a really long time, and all of it kind of started to click. So I just said, you know what, let me combine all of them, because I started to see kind of like a Venn diagram where you have separate topics that seem really distant, but
Yeah.
when you kind of think of them, they start to combine these really weird ways. So I'll just do like a high level overview, and we could touch over some of the points that like all connect together. So
Perfect.
um, in the article, I kind of talk about the past, and more specifically, like the counterculture of the 1960s and the 1970s, both from the angle of like the radical political change that was happening at the time, and the cultural change that was happening with civil rights and the psychedelic movement kind of kicking off at the time and combining in some pretty cool aspects. I gotta find it pretty often that when people talk about like the counterculture of the time, they tend to paint it as like everybody in the counterculture was like white, middle class stoners, like doing LSD in San Francisco, and like the stereotypical idea of like hippie dropouts and stuff like that. But I wanted to point out in the article that like the importance that marginalized people played in the core of the early counterculture. And they were at the core at producing the social and cultural and political change that kind of happened out of that. So the topic of the counterculture was brought up from a piece by Mark Fisher that he was working on called Acid Communism. And in that piece, he kind of both like criticized and praised the counterculture of the 60s. For a really long time, he had been really critical of the counterculture through a lot of his works, through a lot of his lectures, through a lot of like, talking to other people. And then all of a sudden, it felt like he had like this change of heart when it came to the counterculture. Um, and so from that paper or from that work, he was talking about some of the failures, but also some of like the potentials out of this idea of acid communism. Um, and so while he was working on that, he was also doing a lecture series called Post Capitalist Desire, which
Yeah.
I think we could both agree that sounds way better than acid communism for a whole bunch of
Definitely.
reasons.
Yeah.
We can get into that because there's a lot of stuff to unpack in just those two words of acid communism versus post
Hmm.
capitalist desire. But in this work, he described libidinal Marxism, like a new form of leftist organizing in politics that took and learned from the failures of the 60s counterculture and progressed past it.
Hmm.
So he was describing new forms of organizing and conceptualizing about the world in a way that wasn't like hauntological and didn't rely on old, views of the past. And so while I was listening to an audiobook of the post-capitalist desire lectures, hearing his descriptions of kind of new ways of imagining a future that involved social change and cultural change, Solarpunk really kept coming up in my mind because at the time too, I was really getting into the ideas behind Solarpunk and starting to write fiction and starting to write articles and stuff like that about Solarpunk. And so it was kind of one of those things where all these three things were starting to combine together. And so in the article, I really wanted to show like the connections between what I see of like a type of acid communism that Solarpunk envisions, while also imagining a new form of a counterculture, but also learning from the pitfalls that we saw from the counterculture and actually seeing some of the same issues from the counterculture pop up even now. So it's kind of a cyclical process of like looking back at the past, but also looking at the future and trying to figure out new ways of thinking of this stuff.
Yeah, I went through Mark Fisher's work in the past few months. Actually, I was kind of vaguely familiar with him before. Um, Unfortunately, I was in London when he died by suicide, so I remember this being in the news. So I was familiar with Capitalist Realism, which I guess is his most famous work. So I read that one about a couple of months ago, and then I read the second one, which I think is called Ghost of My Life, and that one is the one that really clicked with me. Even more, I mean, the first one is really good as well, but that one really clicked with me because I've been doing this doctorate on and off for several years now, and a good chunk of the theme is hauntology, like in the Derrida sense in French as well. And Fisher had this ability, because like the way I describe it, because I've been thinking about this as well, obviously in preparing for this episode, is Derrida and a bunch of other folks focused a lot on like the ghosts of the past and how they haunt the present. So like the big example is obviously like the end of history in the early 90s, the declaration by Fukuyama and others. And Derrida comes along, writes this book called The Spectres of Marx, and says that, well, actually, because you've declared it dead, it's now haunting you because nothing is ever fully over in that sense. I'm simplifying a bit, but that's kind of the gist of it. And Mark Fisher comes along and says there's that, but there's also the not just him. There's Avery Gordon, who has this term called haunted futurities, if I'm pronouncing it right, and a bunch of other scholars and like folks, interesting folks, thinking about it along these lines. But Fisher frames it in this very interesting way. It's not just like the hauntings from the past, but it's also the hauntings of the futures that have never come to pass, right? And this could be anything from, even in the Arab world, for example, anything from like pan Arabism or pan Islamism or modernity or capitalism, what have you. If you look at the discourses and writings of this whole post colonial era, let's say 50s onward, especially 60s and 70s, uh, the visions were not the same, but they were all sort of promising a better future. They were all saying like the future will be better, and this is why it has to be under some kind of Arab identity or Islamic identity, or it's communism or it's capitalism or whatever. They all had this idea that the future will be better, and come roughly the more or less parallel to what was happening in the West along the same time, or roughly the 90s, 80s, 90s. This starts dissipating. This starts kind of even before the 9/11, 2003 invasion of Iraq, and that sort of everything that follows since then. That sort of started dying out. And so it was very interesting for me that Mark Fisher was writing this book and focusing on the UK and the US to some extent, but especially in the UK. And I'm like, well, this sounds super familiar. Like, and this ends up being bizarre. You know, it's a bizarre experience to read this as a Lebanese who has this very different or seemingly different experience. And Mark Fisher is describing something very specific, 90s music scene, early 2000s, sort of what followed the whole Thatcher revolution or counter revolution or whatever, and the advent of neoliberalism. And I'm here from like this seemingly again different context, and something very similar has been going on at the same time. So I can talk about this forever, but like what talk to us a bit about like what did you find useful or interesting or what have you in like that sort of framing, that sort of thinking.
Yeah, a big thing for me is just like, especially at the times now, is kind of grappling with climate anxiety and grappling with my own conceptions of the future. And so, like, I think like a lot of people, I kind of fell into um, kind of a deep nostalgia of trying to find ways of thinking about the future. But every single time where I think about, okay, what would 10, 15, 20 years in the future look like, I always kind of came up against a wall of, well, we're either going to be in some kind of like nuclear dystopia or something like that, or it's going to look like, I don't know, this particular book that I read about,
Yeah.
about cyberpunk or something like that. But I never had a conception of like thinking outside of those terms of thinking about this media that I consumed over time, that like it felt like the future was literally canceled. Like I could only go back to past iterations or past ideas about the future. And so like when I came across Solarpunk, it was kind of a click because it combined a whole bunch of different topics that I felt at the time weren't really connected, and kind of connected them. I really do think like Solarpunk is a good catch-all term of like a whole bunch of different disciplines or
Mm-hmm.
ideas that can combine together. But in general, I think it's what caught me was finally being able to think like, okay, there actually is a viable future, but it's in combining these things that most people wouldn't think about going together. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but tell us more about that. What are these things? What are some of these things anyway?
Well, I guess like a major part of that is the conception about like technology and ecology as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that kind of ties into degrowth, which is kind of a big social and political questioning of technology, of society, of civilization. I think a lot of people who have a lot of issues with how our current worlds are going and want a better future are questioning, okay, well, how would we get to a better future? What kind of materials are going into that? You know, like how are we actually going to build this type of stuff?
Yeah.
And I think that's a real actual concern that people have. And so when I thought about new futures, I saw the technology, but also like I think our conceptions of sci-fi almost always kind of stick to like, you know, shiny robots in the future. But who is making those robots? Where do the raw materials for those robots come from? Where does this shiny future actually legitimately come from? And so
Mm-hmm.
thinking about um, technology and how that directly impacts ecology, especially going on to the future, because I mean, climate change is going to determine how we live in the future and whether or not we can adapt to climate change or adapt with climate change, and change our ways of living, but not also that, but like change our social arrangements as well.
Yeah, one
Um,
one sorry, one of the kind of the slogans that I like from the degrowth movement is that like change is inevitable. The main difference is whether it's change by design or change by disaster. I whether like how much of a say do we want to have in that change? Because just to sorry to interrupt you, just
oh, no.
yesterday, what we're recording this on October 13th. Just yesterday, I was in another part of Switzerland. I was taking part in this panel with Julia Steinberger, who's a climate scientist. She co-wrote part of the IPCC reports, and she's a good friend. And the conversation was essentially about like different futures, very similar to what we're the kind of conversation we're having now. And at some point, it sort of dawned on me that part of the premise was flawed. Part of the premise of our conversation was flawed because the way it was framed by the moderators, the you know the people who kind of decide on the general idea of what we're going to discuss, is that okay, we want to have this change, but how do we convince enough people to join us? And it kind of ended up for me feeling a bit too much of an individualistic thing. Like we just need to convince other people's, which is important, but like that's not the only thing that needs to be done. And I ended up saying like we're still framing, and this is where Mark Fisher comes into, like when we speak about um solar punk, about degrowth, about all of those potential ways forward out of what is up until now like a very very dark future. We're always facing this wall of people or of media or whatever, and this rhetoric of well that's not that's not realistic. Like we have to be realistic about things. Again, going back to capitalist realism, and I brought up that point that realism is kind of a very subjective thing. It's very socially conditioned. It's a social construct, we might say, and it can be constructed in a different way. And so for me, yeah, for me, I was like, we really need to understand that even when we talk about the economy, quote unquote, there's this term covers a lot. Like it's, it says it hides a lot more than it uncovers, if that makes sense. So yeah, just I wanted to add that. I don't want to didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh no, not at all. I think that adds to the point of like, you know, when we're talking about being realistic about the economy and stuff like that, I think it's more detrimental and not realistic at all to assume that growth will be infinite for eternity. Like we're
Yeah.
gonna have for forever constant growth, both from an economic sense and from like a material sense. Like
Hmm.
we have finite resources on this planet, and so we can't continuously keep going on this growth paradigm. And so like we really need to think about that, because if we're talking about better futures, we also have to talk about where these resources are coming from. And the real realism is understanding that like we are coming to a point where the constant growth of capitalism is going to have to stop. It's either going to have to plateau or a total crash, because there are finite resources. And so, really, what we have to think about is what a new future look like if we changed our economic relations and our social relations. to question growth, but also think of things in new ways. So like with technology, for instance, the reasons why technology is made the way that it is for profit,
Hmm.
to maximize profit. And so we extract rare earth minerals to make high technology, basically to create more profit. And so when we're talking about building better futures, well, we also have to think, okay, well, can these technologies work in different ways? Can our ideas of technology and ecology change to where they don't rely on constant, unending growth, and instead, um, our new futures can question that, can question how we live at a fundamental level. And so that's where I think like a lot of what Mark Fisher was talking about was questioning at a fundamental level our conceptions of the past and like our future conceptions of what a counterculture in the now would look like a future or a modern
Hmm.
counterculture. What would that look like? And I think that's um, like a modern counterculture would borrow a lot from the degrowth movement, from a lot of different movements who are saying, hey, let's not go to the past, let's look and try and create a future while also thinking about critically the parts of our day-to-day lives that are going to be impacted by climate change in the future.
Exactly. Yeah. It just makes me think also like Julia, the scientist I mentioned, she has given this example a few times of she assigned to her students. I think I might misremember some of the details, but it was something along the lines of like essentially like imagine a future scenario. Imagine like 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line, and write about it, like write a fiction story or something along those lines. And they all had a lot of difficulties doing so. Um, and that's very significant. Like one example, and this is like stealing from Frederick Jameson's whole it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I think it's been attributed to either him or Zizek or some other. I mean, lots of folks have said this, but anyway. And basically, like what I'm trying to say is also like literally today, it's easier for a kid, I don't know, like 5 years old maybe or 8 or something, to imagine a zombie apocalypse than to imagine a positive future. At the very least, at some point in your teenage years, that becomes so much easier to do because so much of culture in general, pop culture, main culture, culture in general, things that people consume, especially a good chunk of movies, so many books, so many TV series are about the end of times in one way or another, or at least some kind of apocalyptic future or post-apocalyptic future. Blade Runner, I don't know, I Am Legend, whatever, any of these things. And what I always try also kind of emphasize, and this is semi jokingly, but it's true. Like when we watch a film like I Am Legend, and I'm only mentioning this because I watched it a couple of months ago. It's not that good, but in the beginning of the film is when you start seeing this whole zombie, whatever they are, apocalypse started happening, and most people who watch that film end up identifying with the main character, played by Will Smith, obviously. No one identifies with the most people who are dead within like 5 minutes, right? Like you're never the person in the background. You're always the hero in those films, and that's just not how anything works. That's just not reality. But this ends up actually informing a lot of what we end up thinking of as realism. And even in I got into at some point like the prepping world and that sort of thing, and there is a very toxic version of that which I think most people are familiar, and other I feel like just more sober about things. But the more toxic version are the ones that see themselves as realists as well, because they end up having this idea. And here I'm referring to like people who say, well, I'm gonna have to have a, I don't know, bazooka in my bunker and shit, like stuff like that. Those are the folks who think that, well, it's I these are the tools that I need to survive. And what's often missing is, do I have enough friends? Like, do I know 10 people who can be there for me, or can be there for them? Do I know my neighbors? Stuff like that. And because there is these mental shortcuts, I feel like, and they're often provided in through these films. And I say this because I genuinely thought like this for some time, for like a good chunk of my
Same,
teenage years. I think
same.
because it's
Mhm.
normal. It's an easy, like, yeah, of course everyone is evil except me, and of course they're gonna try and kill me or whatever, and I need to survive, and that's how things are. And I mean, we're saying this a bit like half jokingly, but honestly, I think this sort of cynical worldview actually informs a lot of, for example, climate change related discourses, because most people are not hard climate deniers. Most, I mean, I don't have statistics, but I think most people are aware that there's something going on, but they would be like what's called soft climate deniers. I say like, yeah, it's a problem, but like, what can we do? Or we're doing the most that we can. And even if you literally point them out, like bullet point by bullet point, like, no, we're not, and this is why we're not, and this is what we might do, not that I necessarily have the answers, but we have more answers than what is often portrayed or what is often talked about. Like, there are concrete things that can be done and that climate scientists often talk about and have been actually more vocal about it. Julia was arrested 2 days before, the day before our so a couple of days ago now, because she was blocking a highway to bring attention again to this problem. And but it was part of this campaign called Renovate Switzerland, which are asking the government to fund the renovation of buildings to make them more, what's the word in English, um, so that like heat doesn't dissipate, or there's a word, sorry,
Oh, like
insulate.
insulated? Yeah, yeah.
Exactly, yeah, thanks, insulated. So anyway, all of this to say that like we're at the point now where like climate scientists are becoming activists. A bunch of people are starting to understand that neutrality is no longer possible. And what I think folks like us, if that's not too arrogant of me to say, can do is kind of complement the hard science, because the hard science in and of itself is just, it's too much for most people, and it's not necessarily pointing to, well, okay, this is what needs to be done, but how can we do it, and how can we motivate people to do it, and how can we motivate ourselves to even believe that this is possible. And this is where I think, like, the stuff that you're talking about and what you've been writing about, and it's on your Substack, and you also on this other podcast which is lovely called Solarpunk now. I'll probably do some collaboration with them at some point, which might be out before this is out. I don't know how timelines work on and podcast scheduling, but in any case, but all of this to say that there is like the very hard sciencey work that needs to be done and that is being done, and that is often actually constrained. The IPCC, part of the critique of the IPCC reports, is that it's constrained by quote unquote capitalist realism, right? Like, okay, you're telling us this, but what can we do about it? Because we're not necessarily the only audience. Obviously, it has to be a UN approved thing, and the main audiences are the nation states that signed on to the Paris Agreement and so on. And they have different priorities, or at least many of those governments have different priorities than just quote unquote tackling the climate crisis. They're happy to kind of pay lip service to it, but as long as it doesn't harm the actual priority, which is
Hmm.
maintaining capitalism and maintaining quote unquote economic growth. So I'll just give you some time to reflect on that, because I feel like I've been rambling for too long. And then
No, no.
listeners should know that I sent you this Google Doc with like bullet points, and we're like at number 2 because I just expected this was gonna happen, but it's fine.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I think that a lot of this has to do with the ideas of like pedagogy, of like people have no clue what's out there because they have no clue that it exists. And so when you feel like there's no alternatives to reality because you've never really seen the alternatives or never really heard the alternatives, you kind of get stuck in this framework of thinking. And so, like, I think that subverting pedagogies of disaster, of endless capitalism and endless growth, subverting those thoughts and trying to show people that there is an alternative, I think, like, kind of connects back to the psychedelic aspects of post-capitalist desire and of acid communism, because it's not really necessarily all about doing LSD and doing psychedelics. It's really about using the psychedelic to, or really like art, music, feeling, emotion combined with the logics of the hard sciences to subvert kind of our hard wall of thinking about the realities, and thinking about reality. So, trying to show people that, this alternative exists is one thing. Speculation is one thing. Just kind of like, oh, hey, here's a cool sci-fi reality that, we're all talking about, better futures and all this, but like, how does that actually happen? Or like, what's the hard science behind that would actually make that happen? And so I think it's really important to not just think in like speculative terms, but use speculation and fiction, use and think about emotion. How do people feel? Like how a really big thing to me is, especially with science fiction and talking about futures and better futures, is like, how would my day to day look like in a better future? How would my day to day life look like? Living and adapting with climate change. If I can't see myself and feel myself in this new world, how am I supposed to have new thoughts about the future if I can't even imagine myself in it? And so, like, that's where I see the ideas of pedagogy, the ideas of acid communism, and the psychedelic, and using art, literature, music in a form that combines with the hard sciences to like actually convey what we're talking about. Because yeah, I think a lot of people, when you throw the hard facts about climate change or the hard facts about some of the social issues that we have today, a lot of people shut down because exactly, they have no clue of what to do about it. And so I think that a way around that is to say, like, here are some things that you can actually do, but not on like an individualistic level. Not like, oh, prep for the future by hoarding a bunch of beans and guns in a bunker, but understanding that like there's a difference between individual action and individualist action, because individual action is with the end goal of collective action.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I could talk more about what I mean by that. So let's take, for instance, an individual action with the end goal of a collectivist action.
Mm-hmm.
An individualist action might be you deciding to make your own garden, for instance. Let's start there. That's a very like common thing with Solarpunk is talking about community gardens,
Mm-hmm.
food sovereignty, stuff like that. It's technically an individual action, which a lot of people would say, okay, well, we're not going to be able to solve anything with just individual actions, which is true to a sense. But there needs to be the ability for people to understand that there are actions that you can take that snowball into collective action, that snowball into larger pushes towards things. So, individual starts a garden. They start out, they start gardening, learning more about the ecosystem, learning more from indigenous people about what the ecosystem looked like before all this development happened, um, and start getting more interested into the ecology. Okay, that's great. Well, that alone isn't going to solve climate change, and isn't
Mm-hmm.
going to solve a lot of the social issues that we have. So this person starts growing more stuff. They start having a little bit more surplus. They start sharing it with their neighbors. Then you're starting to talk about, okay, well, you're moving from individual action, not individualist, but individual action, and now you're starting to do kind of some forms of mutual aid, sharing resources with your neighbors, starting to talk to people in your area. Maybe you convince them to start their own gardens of their own, and so now you're starting to see like one individual action start to morph and change, and more people are doing these sorts of things. More and more people, say, in an area are starting to grow their own food locally. Um, and from that, more and more neighbors are talking to each other, growing their own separate gardens together, talking to each other, and they're like, okay, let's start a community garden. So that way everybody in the community can have access to food. And so, you starting a community garden, people start um, meeting up at this place, and meeting up at the garden, helping each other out, giving out food. There's more surplus. That surplus, goes towards feeding people who actually need it, meeting the actual needs of people directly. Um, and from there, you start to create a real community, and things spiral from there. Things snowball and grow together. So you have like the start of an individual action that, with the end goal, has a collective action, and all it really takes is for that to combine together with other people to really start making larger changes. And so um, I think that there are definite differences between like individual and collective, but I think that both of them are intertwined. The collective action um, can start on the individual on the collective action can start on the individual level, but
Hmm.
also the individual level can't start without the collective thought and the collective pedagogy or the collective idea that a better future is possible.
I'm thinking that a lot of what we're talking about sort of already exists in part of popular culture, even as cliches, right? Like in you have, I don't know, like they didn't know it was impossible, so they did it, stuff like that. And what's always funny about that is that people end up, I think, I could be wrong, but I think that these cliches, let's say, end up kind of being diluted because they have to fit the world. They have to quote unquote be realistic. So something like you can do anything that you want, that you put your heart, your mind to, stuff like that, ends up actually being about, how can you be more efficient at your job, or how can you write a better CV, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And my thing in I mentioned these examples because also part of what I try to do is have examples that are actually relatable and use that to make this other points. One thing I actually enjoy doing a lot is talk a lot about known TV series and known movies. I talk about the Avengers a lot because I feel like most people have seen them. Stuff like that, or cultural references that I don't know if I have no idea if maybe someone who's actually younger than me would know, like the Jetsons and the Flintstones and stuff like that. Because something that's very interesting with our generation ish and maybe like millennials, Gen Z, roughly that age bracket, so 40s and under ish, I guess, is obviously the internet. And those who remember slightly a time before the internet, or those who basically just grew up with it, or those who grew up with web 1.0, 2.0, whatever, those kinds of differences for me are super interesting because now the internet is sort of this memory box in many ways where we're able to go back to stuff in the past and then it ends up being memeified, and it ends up becoming this very interesting, sometimes dark, but when not dark, interesting thing, like this tool at the end of the day. And I find it very interesting to go through stuff like just a few days ago I learned, and I was looking at it while you were talking, but so the Jetsons premiered 60 years ago, this
Wow.
year, 2022, and it's set in 2062, because this whole 100 year in the future thing. And the guy, the main guy, George Jetson, is supposed to be 40, and so he was born in this year. He was born in 2022 in the timeline of the thing. And obviously in that universe, for those who don't know, I mean, just write the Jetsons with a J on YouTube, find the trailer. That's the gist of what we're talking about. It's futuristic, multi-planetary species and whatnot. What's kind of funny about that is that even though they're on a different planet and whatnot, it's still capitalist. They're still shopping. You know,
There's still traditional gender roles of like women
exactly,
doing the
exactly,
housework. The robot
exactly,
is like an automated robot who is a woman who does all the housework. Like it's fucking crazy. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
exactly. But so if you're watching this in 2062, and I don't know, hopefully I'm old enough to do that by then, but I'm around. I mean, it's not, probably 2062 would not look like the 2062 and the Jetsons. I mean, probably. I'm not gonna jinx it, but probably. And at the very least, gender roles, which is a good thing, will definitely not be like that. I mean, again, I don't want to jinx things, but hopefully.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. um, but yeah, it's just so interesting because then what you actually remember is that this is the future as imagined by those writers and creators and whatnot in 1962. And it's still interesting, like despite the flaws, it's still interesting to watch stuff like that. And that's why I'm so into Star Trek as well, for the same reason. Because I was watching, I saw, I don't know if you know a bit about, so there's the next generation, which is the super popular one, but there is the first one before that, which is the original series. And the original series, TOS, is the one that I'm now watching. I hadn't actually watched it before. It's the whole Mr. Spock, that sort of thing. And but the gender roles in TOS are much more, to my eyes, antiquated, or they have not aged well whatsoever, than even in TNG, which is not perfect, and there are still stuff, but there's a huge leap between. That's like a few years in between them. In the first one, it's really like women are literally dressed in a certain way. sexualized in a certain way, and almost always there's some kind of submissive role in one way or another, and it's always the guys doing things and whatnot. And the radical thing at the time is that they're just not all white guys. You know, so if you're non-white guys, um, but again, it's set even further than 2062. I actually don't know on the spot, which is embarrassing, but it's like 200 years in the future or so, or 300 years in the future or something like that. And it's still like, okay, technology is a bit better and more interesting and whatever, but gender roles are basically the 1960s America, you know, white America specifically. And this is what the future looks like. Even the alien species are mostly white people, you know, and complete, not even humans, like just different species, completely humanoids as they call them, are
Yeah.
mostly white people. And that says a lot. But it says a lot for me today, like from my perspective today. I'm sure there were smart people even in the 1960s who were writing about that, but I think not enough probably compared to what we have today, and that's a good thing. And so for me, the advantage of what we have now, just the tools of the internet, having access to certain websites, I don't know, whatever, despite all of their flaws, like a YouTube or a Netflix or whatever, is being able to, if you're so minded, if that's what you're looking for, look at all of those older sci-fi films and TV series, which for me are always more evocative than reading a book, which is amazing as well. But it's because like literally how did they picture it and how did they literally film it? You know, it's always very interesting. So all of this to say that what they were writing, let's say the Jetsons or Star Trek in the 1960s, for them, they were imagining a future that was realistic. Like these are not, it's not fantasy. It's not like we're not talking about elves and whatever, orcs and whatever, like in Lord of the Rings. We're talking about, well, okay, it's going to be more high tech, but there's a reason, there's a logic to that high tech. You know, it's scientific and somehow. And okay, we can comment on the technology, but they also had a social commentary that for them, they assumed that 300 years into the future, well, of course, gender roles are going to be that way because why wouldn't they? You know, like, and these assumptions carried them, so to speak, 200, 300 years, and it colored what they thought the future would be like. So,
Yeah.
this is why I just find it, and it's maybe I tell myself I'm doing like research when I watch Star Trek or something to kind of like, oh, I'm not wasting my time now. I'm doing research, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, it kind of goes back to hauntology of, like, even if you're thinking of the future, you're still using the same ideas that were, like, so locked into the past. And I think that's honestly easier for a lot of people, is to hang on to these old frameworks because it's a lot easier to just hold on to them than it is to just think about something new. I
Like
think that, like,
British monarchy stuff, you know, those series where you have, I don't know, what's it, Downton Abbey, you know, The Crown. You know, it's very because it's like it's set in time. They're set in their ways. People know their roles more or less, and you kind of lose yourself in that world. You're one of them, you know, in that sense. Kind of play acting. You're really putting yourself in that world. I mean, I don't, but folks do.
yeah, exactly. And it's simple. It's easy because things are laid out in specific ways. There is a social hierarchy that's easy to understand. There is a economic hierarchy that's easier to understand. And so, to think about the future is, well, let's maintain these hierarchies. Let's maintain these social arrangements because it's easier to conceptualize our lives around it. And so, like, yeah, you see with a lot of, especially right wing media, it is extremely looking towards the past. It's locked into the past because that's easier to maintain, is easier to conserve these past thoughts when thinking about a future. Um, and it's easier to maintain that simplicity because when you look at even a lot of, like, right wing and especially fascist talking points, they always revolve around appeals to emotion that don't involve, first of all, don't involve logic in any sense, and second of all, are always extremely simple. They're easy quips to just throw out. When you talk about, actual logical arguments we're talking about, especially leftist arguments, are based in, you know, reasoning with logic and all this kind of stuff, it's harder to maintain those quips and just throw out these easy to say simplistic arguments, because what we're talking about isn't simple. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of sliding scales between things. Take for instance gender. A sliding scale on gender and sexuality that isn't black and white. There is no simplicity, and so it's really hard to just easily throw out, oh, here's a simplistic answer to gender roles, for instance, because we have to talk about all these things that are behind just something that seems so simple as, like, how do people who are gendered as male or gendered as female socially, I mean, how do these people interact and why do these gender roles happen? Well, you have to go into the background of patriarchy, you have to go into the background of all these different things, whereas I'd say like right wing fascist traditionalism can very easily say, well, that's just the way that things are. And so we kind of see this reflected in our ways of conceptualizing the future, because it's a lot easier to just remain in the past, to remain in these like strict roles. So like when you're talking about Star Trek and imagining the future, and the fact that like it still feels like the 1960s, like that's the goal for some people, because they can't even imagine getting past those points. And so I think that, yeah, like it's super important to be able to say like there is a very good alternative to what we're talking about. And when we think about the future, we can't rely on these like really simplistic old ways of thinking. Maybe we should question the foundations of all this stuff that we're talking about.
And what's very revealing, even about the example you mentioned, like the whole right wing nostalgia, for lack of a better term. Nostalgia is a kind of a loaded term here, but um, a lot of it, for example, if I think of quote unquote traditional masculinity, I would here in the US context, a lot of it would be reference to, I don't know, a John Wayne figure or something like that, and the whole, Wild West and whatever, stuff like that. But those are movies. And a lot of those movies are not based on something that actually happened. It's just it's an imagination of people in the 1950s ish, 40s, 50s, I guess, of what 100 years before that looked like. And it's not necessarily the most accurate representation of the past. And obviously, there's the erasure of indigenous folks, which I think is pretty obvious at this point, or just like actually treating them as the people to literally murder, which is also in many of those in that genre. But anyway, the point to say is that you have this entire masculinity, which was then embodied by someone like Ronald Reagan, a literal actor, and people who wouldn't in a, I don't know if I'm thinking of the evangelical right-wing Christians who kind of voted for that because they became political really around the same time, post Jimmy Carter. Um, they projected on this empty vessel in many ways what they thought he was about and what he was defending. And obviously, I think it's even more obvious with the figure of Donald Trump, who's
Mhm.
as not what supposedly what they stand for. But the point is, what I'm trying to say is that they don't actually stand for that. And the other example that is taken, I think, even more for granted, like when I give the example of John Wayne and I go, oh, masculinity, whatever, a lot of folks, especially of a certain political tendency, let's say, wouldn't debate me or disagree with me. Oh, yeah, this is obvious. Sure, okay, lefties and whatever. So they would agree with that, obviously. But then when I talk about cars and how there is actually it is a car culture that has been very much, in many ways, purposefully designed that way in many of those movies. And I have the receipts. People have written books on this. It's not like some conspiracies. It doesn't take rocket science, really.
Yeah.
And then there is a direct correlation between, for example, imagining owning a car with freedom. Well, now you can, and there's a masculinity aspect to this as well. Although the car companies have tried to have a quote unquote feminist version of that as well. Of like, you own your own car and then you can go wherever and you drive into the distance and you're free and that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
there's a direct correlation, if not causation, between this and then not having good public transportations. There is a direct, like, we can literally go through the timeline of where these things have been happening, especially in the US. to a lesser extent, thankfully for me, because I'm in Europe, but in Europe it has happened as well. And now it ends up becoming, again, we're facing today, literally today, an energy crisis, which would objectively be alleviated by with a transition to green energy, and at the same time, because that's not enough, a reduction of car use being faced, which is supposed should be the realism, but being faced with the whole, or you're not being realistic. People are gonna need cars, and so obviously, then the only acceptable discussion or debate, if you want, because they end up they usually what ends up being um, the acceptable framework, let's put it that way, is, well, obviously we need to transition to electric cars. Like that's, it's like, cool, maybe like 1% of humans, maybe, I don't know, but the majority, literally is not possible. There's literally not enough. It's not possible to have every single human being use
Yeah.
an electric car. We just do not have enough minerals for that. And not that it wouldn't even be desirable were that be the case, because public transportation, objectively, already proven a billion times, is more efficient. It's just more efficient. And so if we're
Exactly.
talking about where we want to, capitalism is supposed to be this thing where, because of the magic of the market and supply and demand, blah, 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 the most efficient thing is obviously going to be the one that's going to be prioritized. Then it clashes completely with the reality of things, that actually these things are, as of now, being artificially supported, artificially in quotation, as in subsidized by governments. Vast majority of airports are subsidized because they would collapse without it. And so we're
Yeah.
not talking about, do we believe in the magic of the market, because they don't seem to even believe in it in the first place.
No, because it's all based off of these like imaginaries and these things that, because they want to return, and I use they as, not really a giant like term, but people want to imagine um the past that isn't real. It isn't based in reality. And so, like, yeah, like you said, like we can't even conceptualize like getting around not using cars. We can't even think about a world without cars because our past has been so tainted by cars. And like every single piece of media that we see in the past is so related to cars for a very specific reason.
And there are so
And
many car ads all the
yeah.
time, 24/7, regardless of what you're doing, there's a car ad.
And so, like, yeah, like we can't even think about the past in a way that's based in reality, because if we're thinking about a past based in reality, we can see that there's plenty of cities that had robust public transport, that had actual like electric powered trolley systems that were efficient, that didn't require fossil fuels, that we would consider to be futuristic, that were happening in like the late 1800s, that were systematically destroyed by car culture. And so, like, yeah, it ends up going back to our pedagogy, our ideas of what reality, quote unquote, would actually like entail. And our reality it has been hijacked because we can't um, look at the reality of the future and the past, because we're so stuck in these like made up conceptions of whatever we think should be happening in the past and the future. Yeah, that's interesting.
So to go back to Solarpunk a bit, I, weirdly enough, while I discovered Solarpunk about 2 years ago on this podcast. Actually, I had a friend, Emmy Bevansy, and at the end of every episode, as we'll do as well this time around, I ask folks to recommend like 3 books and so on. And Emmy basically said they recommended a couple of books, and honestly, anything that's Afrofuturist or Solarpunk, because I find it, and I'm paraphrasing, I find it impressive or inspiring that people are still able to even have hope, that sort of thing. So Solarpunk, obviously, it clicked, and I did like what most people do. I wrote Solarpunk on Google, and I found Andre's video, "What is Solarpunk?" on YouTube. Saint Andrew, as he was known back then. I think now it's just called Andrewism. It's on YouTube. People can just write "What is Solarpunk?" and in any case, they can listen to the podcast because I interviewed him as well. And that clicked. It's like, well, this is what I was thinking about. I just didn't have a term for it. It's just it is, because it's that thing, like, in a time of where uh, the status quo is hopeless. then hope can be radical. Hope can be, it doesn't have to be. It could be an escape, which it might be needed for some folks. No judgment there, but it can be radical if done in a certain way, or clearly in what we're talking about here. And another thing that I kind of like is this idea, which I've been kind of thinking about, that because I've had this question a number of times, because obviously the stuff that I do for some context, or I think listeners already know by this, but this by now, sorry, but like I write about and I work on pretty depressing stuff most of the time. So what I do, like my PhD, is depressing as fuck. Like there's just no way around it. It's on hauntings and trauma and those who were forcibly disappeared in Lebanon and the civil war, and it's like there's but the last chapter is slightly more quote unquote optimistic or more positive, you might say. But it's a heavy topic. It's a very and I watch films and documentaries that are just by their very nature very, very difficult to go through.
Mhm.
And so the general question, they often something I often get is like, well, how do you still have hope after this? And and the answer often is no, not necessarily. But I sort of I've come to terms with, and this may it's just like my own thing, is that even when I don't have hope, I try and create hope. So if I don't have hope, I try and read and consume or observe or whatever other folks who, when I'm listening to them or viewing them or whatever, they seem to have hope. Maybe by the time I've listened to their stuff, they've lost hope. I don't know. But it's like this is the advantage of the internet, obviously, is that the timelines can be a bit more flexible, so to speak. Like temporality itself is becoming a bit more all over the place. It's no longer, it's not just like past, present, future in this sort of like linear timeline. And for me, that sort of thing, and there's a bit of a um, even useful um, lesson there in some sense, because even when I don't feel the hope, I may still do something which can help someone else have hope, if that makes sense. So even if I'm not personally feeling particularly great today, which is pretty common. It's not. I'm not. I don't necessarily wake up and feel amazing. It takes me some time, and I have depression and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but I kind of go from the assumption that there is a lot of horrible stuff happening in the world, and there's no point of sugarcoating it. It's very difficult, and it's horrible suffering, all of these things which I work on as a journalist as well.
mhm,
But in the same way as it is impossible, literally impossible for me to consume all of that news, let's say, or to even think about all of that stuff at the same time, because there's just too much. It's just not physically possible. It's also impossible for me to keep track of all of the positive stuff that are happening or people are thinking about or writing or doing, literally like direct action or activism or that other sort of thing, because for the most part there's no need. If you're doing community gardening, which is having a genuine, like real impact for like hundreds of people, let's say, you won't necessarily live stream every single day, because the entire point is that you're being present now in the moment with these other folks, and something
yeah,
is being built, often slowly but surely, and it's very valuable. And so I try and remember this, but this requires, if I may put it that way, a bit of imagination. It's just not. It's not imagination in the sense that, again, I'm not imagining elves and orcs and Middle Earth and that sort of thing. I'm literally going from a very rational assumption, a very basic assumption that, well, someone is probably doing this now because there's too many of us and someone is doing it. It's gonna happen, and that's a good thing. So I'm gonna kind of focus on that a bit, and maybe even seek them out if possible, because it doesn't take that long, that much. Again, another advantage of the internet. So anyway,
yeah,
all of this to say, to kind of wrap up on my point, that in the same way as I don't when I read a difficult book, or I see something that's very difficult and depressing and traumatic in many cases and so on, it's not that I need to desperately I don't know, filter it with some happy thoughts. I don't know, think happy thought. No, that's not how it works. When this is happening, is just this is just what it is, and it's very horrible and it's very sad and very difficult, etc., and traumatic, as I said. But it's just that what then helps me is that I end up grounding myself and reminding myself that even if my personal experience, because that's also happened to me, it's not just like a foreign thing or something that's happening, quote unquote, on the news.
Mm.
But maybe now I'm not in a good space and mental space, maybe sometimes physical space as well.
Mm-hmm.
But doesn't necessarily mean that this is the end. And for me, this is this is the difficulty of this is the role of the imagination, is that it allows me to actually um putting it a bit more dramatically, like live for another day, live until next week, until next month, until something else happens. And in the
Mm-hmm.
meantime, when I can, I don't always manage to do so. Always easier to preach than to actually do things, but sometimes I try and do that. I create, as I said, create hope even when I don't have. Create something that is hopeful, that can be hopeful for someone else, even when I don't personally, in this moment, even as I'm doing it, feel it in that sense. Because I may feel it later, but someone
Yeah.
else can feel it now.
Yeah, I mean that's the constant thing that I'm like, coming across is coming to the realizations about my own life and about the future. It is bleak. We can't just say, oh yeah, everything's gonna be fine. We can imagine better futures, blah blah blah. While we can do that, we have to come to the realization that the path that we're on is extremely dangerous. A lot of the assumptions that we had, or a lot of the assumptions that we were given, especially our generation from our parents, is that things will continue as they always have for them and their parents and their grandparents. And so, like, especially for me, when I think about the future, it's kind of counterbalanced with the fact that, like, I'm not going to ever retire. I'm constantly going to have to deal with climate change. I'm constantly going to have to deal with natural disasters impacting my life, with the economic disasters impacting my life. And so it's very, very easy to fall into a rut of inaction and saying, like, well, I guess I'll just give up. And it's like, no, when you look at all of human history, when all this stuff is happening, there are for sure people who give up, but there are plenty of people who say there is something worth fighting for. There is something worth on the horizon, even if it's just imaginary, even if it's just a concept of maybe this possible future might happen. There is stuff to keep fighting for. And there are concrete things that I can do, even in the moment, that doesn't seem like it'll have an impact. So, like, if I'm having a really bad day, sometimes it just helps to go out in the garden, plant something, work outside. It helps to work on, like, a little project here and there, or sit down and imagine what would the future look like, what would a great future in my eyes look like, and think, like, okay, well, if I'm imagining a better future and I'm imagining all these cataclysmic things happening, what kind of solutions, or what kind of things can we do to mitigate those risks? Like, what can we do to make people's lives better, or even, like, good in these cataclysmic times? And so then, you're starting to think of, like, okay, well, there is a glimmer of hope. There are things that we can do to change the path that we're on. And what are some concrete things that we can actually do in the here and now that will lead to these types of things? What are some things that I can do, or even a small group of people can do, um, at a community level, at a local level, to really impact change at a broader way? Like,
Hmm.
starting from the small group of people doing direct action and leading into some really amazing collective action happening. I mean, like, you look at something like Occupy Wall Street. Um, that was a really interesting time happening. And I think, like, another closer thing that we got to, another kind of counterculture starting to grow, was people getting fed up and seeing the economic collapses happening, seeing the Iraq War happen, seeing everything that was happening at that time, and saying, like, maybe we should just do something, just do anything, to have a glimmer of hope for the future. And so, even just small actions eventually blew up into what became Occupy Wall Street, and became uh, so many actions during that time, was just from even just a small group of people saying, like, I've had enough. I want to do something. I want to do anything to change this. So,
Uh,
yeah, I don't know. It's hard.
it is. I mean, none of this is easy, really. Um, But I found out, and also to anticipate, because I have been in, or at least I've heard conversations about Occupy Wall Street where some people will say, well, it didn't achieve anything and that sort of thing. But really, the point is that, A, we need to ask ourselves what does achieve mean? How, that's an entirely different debate. But what I'm trying to say is that I've been following protest movements and protests and uprisings and revolutions for about since I took part in one in Lebanon in 2015. So roughly since 2015, less active before that, but a bit before that, but especially since 2015, I've seen in Lebanon two different massive uprisings, and I found it very interesting to actually compare them, 2015 and 2019. 2019, a lot of the lessons from the mistakes from 2015 were learned. Not all of them. And there are still limitations, and there were stuff that I would have liked done in a different way, but whatever. There were still like disagreements, because obviously, especially when you're in a situation where you have mass mobilization, it's not like a million something out of like we're 5 million in Lebanon. Like there's gonna be a lot of folks there, and they're not all in the same page. There's maybe this one thing in common, but that's kind of about it. Everything else is we're not friends. But you have to find a way to make something work. And so, of course, in that protest movements, you will have different, you know, usually how this happens. Oh, the more radicals, the more moderate, the more maybe conservatives, people who are sort of on the fence, who maybe attend once a week. You'll have different roles. And I used to kind of frown upon that or find it very tiring. But I've been kind of revisiting even my own emotions back then, because there was a very distinct different sets of emotions between those 4 years, and obviously growing up a bit, becoming a bit more mature, whatever, all of these things. And I end up actually appreciating a bit more that we're not all on the same page, because I would be weirded out if actually everyone's agreeing with me here. It's just I need to see, and that's just again a cliche for a reason, but you need a bit of everything to kind of make the world work. And in those moments when you really really see that more concretely in any situation, whether it's a protest movement or trying to build some kind of community, what community, to build a community, you will have different skills that you can offer, but you don't necessarily have to have you don't have to. That's the difference between the smart prepping, quote unquote, and here I'm being a bit simplistic, and the kind of more I'm gonna bazooka in my bunker ones, where the one of them assumes that I cannot be a doctor and an engineer and a gardener and a cook and a, I don't know, the carer who's taking care of 3 kids, and it's not possible. Therefore, I need other folks who can do that. And so it's easier to have this idea of, and of course, we can learn from each other, we can then divide tasks, what have you. But then the idea is that you can bring something to the table, and anyone who's listening, I have done this a billion times, and it's always it starts with disbelief, and then it's more like, well, this is obvious. It starts with disbelief, and when you point out well, what are your skills? What do you like to do? What can, because you can also learn, you can grow. It doesn't have to be You don't have to be the perfect artist immediately, or the perfect gardener, which doesn't exist anyway. But you don't have to have all of those skills immediately. You can want to do that, and maybe this is an opportunity to do that. You can help create the opportunity to do that, and then one thing follows the other. And as you said, it can start from an individual effort. I started gardening on my own with my wife, and then now we're actually thinking of, we want to expand it to a more community level. There's a community garden nearby that we just haven't visited yet, and it's like 5 minutes away, like stuff like that. And a lot of the time it comes down to, what are the stuff on a daily basis that are preventing you from exploring these different options, and why does it often come down to, with, oh well, it's just not a realistic thing to do now. I can do it tomorrow maybe, or after tomorrow, or in 10 months or whatever, but like now I need to work. Or okay, let me rephrase this slightly, because obviously there's an element where we still live in capitalism, and there are folks, and many folks, myself included, will have work hours and whatnot. And so I'm not saying, I hope people understand what I'm trying to say here, but I'm not saying it's just about changing your mindset. No, that's the entire problem actually, is that we have structures that prevent us from being free, essentially, from having experimenting and not having to worry about a roof over your head and paying rent and getting food and that sort of thing. What I'm trying
Mm-hmm.
to say is that even despite all of those restrictions, and I know from folks who have been in even worse situations than me, um, there are ways of planting the seeds. Kind of be cheesy about it, planting the seeds for something that will later on be helpful, meaningful, help you be happier, and so on and so forth. And in order to do that, even the mindset, the the motivation, if you want, because being demotivated is a very common problem these days. Even motivated long enough to even want to do something or start doing something that you may not see the result of for some time, weeks, months, maybe even years. That is where, for me, imagination comes into play. And the more it is done, the less individuals will have to do the hard work to constantly have to imagine it. And this goes back to, again, if you're like 7, you know what a fucking zombie is, and you don't know how to imagine a happy future, stuff like that. And
Mm-hmm.
I just want to make that work, that imagine, or we like it should be easier to it should hopefully eventually become easier to do that imagination work, and it no longer feeling like much work, if that makes sense. It's just becoming actually part of the ether, so to speak, in the same way as things like Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement and that sort of thing, which, as with everything, will have flaws and whatnot. But in the same way as it felt almost overnight that a whole bunch of people, it clicked in their mind that, well, this is not good, needs to be changed now. But of course it was not overnight, and that's the point. That's, I guess, the entire point of.
Exactly.
I rambled a lot, sorry, but that's obviously the point of what we were trying to get at here.
No, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of background stuff that ends up coalescing, and then all of a sudden you feel like, oh, this came out of nowhere. Well, no, this came out of somewhere. All
Hmm.
this stuff comes from somewhere because there are people who are constantly in the background, who are constantly working and thinking about these things, and then all of a sudden it comes up because, well, I mean, there's a massive change,
Hmm.
and I think that like imagining will always happen, and I think of like all these things as sparks. There's never like an end goal. There's never going to be some cataclysmic thing that happens that, oh, the end is here. Okay, well, great, we solved everything. No, every single protest movement, every single thing that's happened, the counterculture from the 60s, all these things were sparks that will light the fires for the next spark, that will light the
Hmm.
fires for the next spark, that will carry on and carry on, and we'll see these changes happening. I mean, even in my lifetime, seeing the changes have happened from um, say for instance, like from Ferguson, the protests that happened in Ferguson, into now,
Hmm.
the amount of social change that we've had in America when we think about um, race and social politics, especially for Black people in the U.S., has changed so much because these sparks have ignited something. That sure they have, a lot of these things have been kind of like put out or put down from outside forces, from the U.S. government, from capitalism, trying to make sure that these changes don't happen. But we've seen so much social change happen, and it's not going to be a end all be all.
Hmm.
Here we go, it's all figured out,
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I think that that was a huge thing in Mark Fisher's work as at communism was trying to point out that this wasn't the counterculture didn't fail. Oh, there were a lot of failures between like the end goals that people had, but that was just the beginning. The counterculture made such a huge impact on society, not just the US, but the world over, into thinking in new ways. Whether or not you want to say that the counterculture created neoliberalism, it's more so that neoliberalism filled the void
Yeah.
of what happened after the counterculture.
Yeah.
So, we can look at failures, wins, whatever, or we can look at things as a slow and steady progress to the futures that we imagine, the futures that we want to happen. And instead of looking at things as like black and white, as wins and failures, um, we can look at them as steps towards the new imaginings. And as we kind of progress through, and our conceptions about like culture and society and each other changes, that will also change how we imagine the future going on from there. So it's like, I don't know, I tend to kind of think of it as like not necessarily stepping stones,
Mm-hmm.
but we're building on top of the past, but also trying to reimagine the future based on other changes that we've had along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, and imagining changing our conceptions about kind of like the fundamental stuff that we're talking about is how we get to this next step, how we get to these next, how we get to these next movements. Because I really do feel like, especially now with kind of the climate socially of like Gen Z and millennials, we're starting to see like the anti-work movement starting to really grow. We're starting to see people, especially after 2020 and with the pandemic, we start to see a lot of people being radicalized
Mm-hmm.
from being able to kind of slow down and really think about their lives and think about capitalism and think about how their lives were impacted by the pandemic, by the mass death that we saw. Um, and so, with all that happening, I think that's really combining together to create kind of the kindling for a new fire, for a new spark of whatever countercultural thing that we're going to see with Gen Z and millennials, um, in the near future. And all of that has to hinge on us being able to imagine how we can change our culture and society to fit new realities.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I compare how as a millennial, compare to how I viewed the future of, let's say, like gender or race relations as a kid, it's totally different. Um,
Right.
and same with Gen Z. So it's like learning from each other. Now the world is completely different. I would say socially, we start to see these things change from even like 5, 10 years ago. And so now the conceptions of like getting rid of gender roles or understanding gender on a spectrum or understanding how race and capitalism works together, now we can have an even deeper view, an even better imagination for the future of like what getting past all that will look like.
I'm actually thinking because as we're recording this, the protests are ongoing in Iran, and
Hmm.
for about I think it's gonna be 3 weeks now or something. Hopefully, by the time this is out there, ongoing or something positive has happened. Who knows? But a good chunk of them are being led by what you can call Gen Z, like a very very good decent percentage in the main cities in the regions and so on. And those are folks that for I mean all of them, they haven't lived through obviously the 79 revolution, and they haven't lived through the 80s, which was the very bloody war between Iraq and Iran, and they haven't lived through I mean obviously what happened in the 90s, which wasn't that pretty either. And in many ways, there, and here I'm generalizing a bit because you will have conservatives who are Gen Zers as well. You'll have like supporters of status quo who are, and it's not all black and white, obviously. But just the point isn't that everyone has to be on board. No, it's never the case that everyone is on board. That has never, literally never happened. If I'm not mistaken, when Martin Luther King was assassinated like that year, he was still in the polls like one of the most unpopular black men among white Americans, for example. Like, folks don't like to think about this as much now, I suppose, but it's just a fact. That's just what it was. And same for like the suffragettes in the UK. Like those are things that many I would assume folks know about, maybe that like they were not actually popular in the sense of how they were being portrayed. Eventually they became popular after winning, essentially, at least after forcing the government to some concessions. But the
Hmm.
point is that what was it that drove them to be motivated enough to sort of push through that final goal, so to speak? And how can we emulate that energy, but on a scale that has as of now never been achieved? Obviously we're talking about the global scale, or as
Hmm.
global as possible, because as I said, like you will never have everyone on board. That will not, it's physically, you just don't have the time to do that anyway. But how do you get enough folks on board that for at best enough other folks accept that, well, this seems to be a better future, this seems to be a better change, this seems to be actually better, as I said. And for me, like the notion, the challenge is when I'm in, and I think of it very concretely, because I think this is when we talk about very big concepts, and bringing it back to like the personal level often allows me, at the very least, and I would hope listeners kind of digest things a bit better. And so when I think of like, okay, I'm sitting at a, I don't know, family lunch or something like that, and I'm with folks, relatives and so on, who don't necessarily share my politics. I mean, they don't. You have some things in common, but for the most part, if you're quote unquote the activist in the family, you're often facing people who they don't see themselves as activists because they see themselves as the realists. They see themselves as, well, this is just the way things are. And there's a reason why the way things are the way they are. And then if you get through a conversation again, where you're actually trying to deconstruct, like, let's deconstruct why are they the way they are, and can they be different maybe, and how can they be different, and how can we achieve that, and so on. It's not that they, and I say this because this has happened, it's not that they disagree with me, but it's still not enough to convince them that it is possible. And so again, it goes back, even if they agree with the facts, like even if I'm literally just printing out IPCC reports and just saying literally this is what the scientific status quo is, and this is what we know we need to do, and like, it's even if I do my homework, so to speak, and it's not just, oh, this is like how I want things to be and whatnot, that you will still often, and this has been my experience, come across again this wall of, it's not realistic, it's, this is just how things are. And then obviously, because I'm 31 and I've been doing this now for some time, I end up actually questioning, well, where is their framework coming from? What is their assumption, and why do they have that assumption? And I can reach some conclusions based on what they know about their lives and what they have grown up, maybe in this case Lebanon, or where they currently live, stuff like that. I can reach some kind of picture, which at least allows me to be slightly more patient when I hit that wall, right? Because that's very important. Is that at the end of the day, if, and I think of it that way, like if I manage to convince this aunt or this neighbor or this whatever that this isn't just desirable, but it's feasible, it's possible, I would consider that as more kind of maybe symbolic, not that symbolic, an actual victory, actual win, because that
Yeah.
tells me that that specific messaging worked in that specific context. And I end up kind of realizing that the message cannot always the kind of the methodology can't always be the same. I can't
Hmm.
immediately go to everyone and talk about sci-fi and Star Trek and Solarpunk and whatever, because they won't necessarily relate to it. But we're humans. Language is this very funky thing that we do with one another, and there's often always a way of reaching that other person who, you may not have much otherwise in common with. And for me, this is a way of creating hope even when I don't have hope. So maybe I'm
Hmm.
repeating myself a bit, but this is where this is how I, when I manage, sometimes I don't, but when I do manage, this is how I'm able to do this, continue doing this, even when the horizon is not necessarily like clear, necessarily in front of me. I'm trying to make it clearer, but it's not
Yeah.
necessarily clear. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that like speaking to people in a language that they understand is a little bit easier to get some of these topics in front of people, because there's a lot of negative associations with like terms and stuff like that. If you talk to somebody, say for instance like a conservative, they might agree with you on a bunch of topics. Say for instance like localism, of
Yeah.
moving away from globalist systems into more you know uh, local communities, and bringing back the idea of communities. Like I think we could both agree on that.
Hmm.
But if you say we want to do this through I don't know, some form of democratic confederalism or anarchism or whatever, they instantly shut down. That's it. End of conversation.
Yeah.
But if you can show, okay, well, let's talk about localism. Let's talk about, okay, how do we get corporate and government control out of our lives? Well, maybe we can do that through building autonomous communications or internet systems. Here's how to build it. Here's a prototype, or here's like step by step on how to do this type of stuff. And then it becomes, instead of like this far-fetched reality,
Exactly.
it becomes the reality. It becomes real because you're showing, okay, well, I might tell you, a speculative idea, but here's a device that came from this idea that exists in reality. Thinking about like the future, we're going to be facing water crisis after water crisis.
Hmm.
And so, if you're thinking about the future, you're saying, okay, well, what are some ways that we can capture drinkable water? Um, and so, the idea of like, natural rainwater harvesting or stuff like atmospheric water generation and stuff like that sounds really futuristic until you actually make a device and show somebody the schematics to make it and say, this is the reality that we're going to have to deal with in the future: water scarcity, water problems. Uh, but we have things that me and you can build and do right now to help alleviate that situation in the future. And it's combining that imagination of looking at the future and combining the reality of, okay, well, what are some concrete steps that I can take to get to that future? That I think that circumvents a lot of people's reservations or a lot of people's ideas about reality in the future and about the past too, when you show them the real, and not the hyper real or the imagined past or whatever bullshit fantasy that they have about things. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think that's
Well, I think that's a wonderfully optimistic note to wrap up. I can do this for hours, but I need to make dinner. um, so what I usually do, and I hope I can say that I mean, I'd love to have you on again. I'm sure there's gonna be some topic that we can get into a bit more eventually. Um,
yeah.
okay, so what I usually ask all guests when we kind of finish is like, what are 3 books or other whatever that you would recommend to listeners, and why those 3?
Yeah, so 3 books. So I'd probably start with Walk Away by Cory Doctorow. Fantastic piece of fiction. I would say kind of falls into the idea of Solarpunk.
Mm-hmm.
It's about a near future with a group of people who walk away from normal society and kind of go off and build like these, I guess you could consider egalitarian communes out in the outer regions of these mega cities. And so I think it really does point out some interesting ideas about thinking of the future and thinking about alternative societies, and what that might look like when an alternative society has to deal with the people who are quote unquote realists, who are in reality kind of just maniacs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I really love that book. One of the best pieces of fiction that I personally recommend to like everybody. Another book would be The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wingrove. Probably recommended a lot on your
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
podcast, but it's an amazing book that points out, our ideas of the past are really flawed. And if we're going to look at the realities of, say, indigenous life and the impacts that indigenous people have had on society, we should really look at the realities of the things instead of these made up imaginaries about the past, or made up imaginaries that some people say is reality. Because if we're going to look at reality, let's actually look at the actual history and the impacts that people have had in the future. Another one is Low Tech Design by Radical Indigenism by Julia Watson.
Mm.
And that's LO-TEK Design by Julia Watson. It's an amazing book. It's really well designed. I love the design of it. It has really great pictures and diagrams, but basically it goes into some of the really sophisticated technology that indigenous people around the world have built, both in ancient times and coming up to now, how indigenous people have used what we would consider, I think, especially in the West, as low technology,
Mm-hmm.
but they're extremely sophisticated ways of capturing rainwater, of maintaining ecological resources, of reusing ecological resources that I think a lot of people would consider to be futuristic. But really, humans have been doing this for thousands of years but the histories and the methods have been erased by colonialism and racism and capitalism. And there are people who have solutions, or really who have methods and frameworks of going into the future that we can learn from, who have been doing this for a really long time. And so I think that book really like showcases and shows all the details into like how these systems work and how that impacts their societies too. So yeah, I think that's a really good, great book too.
Amazing. I actually recently started Corey's book. It's amazing so far. I'm sure it's going to continue being amazing. Well, Andre, thanks a lot for coming on. This was really honestly fantastic and much fun. And as I said, I'm sure I'll have you on again at some point.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I know that we have a lot to talk about because we're pretty much on the same page.
Yes, I think so too.
Stuff, so.
Defy These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/FireTheseTimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.